A judge mocked Karoline Leavitt right in court, and minutes later, Attorney General Lisa Kendall had her team unravel a stunning twist. You won't believe what just happened. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. When Karoline Leavitt, the young White House press secretary, stepped into Judge Patricia Donovan's courtroom without a defense attorney in a tense defamation lawsuit, Donovan couldn't hide her smile. With 30 years on the bench, she'd seen all types: powerful politicians, movie stars, con artists, but never had she witnessed such a prominent figure naively take on a courtroom solo. What she didn't expect was that Leavitt's clumsy performance masked a brilliant legal strategy. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. When Horizon News Network's pricey legal team presented their seemingly airtight argument, Judge Donovan continued to mock Leavitt's amateur approach. But behind her flustered demeanor and messy notes lay a trap poised to stun the courtroom, especially the judge who'd underestimated her. Judge Patricia Donovan banged her gavel 3 times, the sound echoing through courtroom 5 of the Los Angeles Federal Courthouse. "Court is in session," she declared, her voice sharp as a blade. "The case of Horizon News Network versus Karoline Leavitt." With 3 decades of experience, Donovan had faced every kind of person. None scared her, none impressed her. So when Karoline Leavitt entered the courtroom without counsel, a faint smile crossed her lips. Another overconfident youngster thinking they can outsmart the law, she thought to herself. "Miss Leavitt," she said, glancing at the file before her, "the record shows you're representing yourself today. Is that correct?" Leavitt stood. She wore an elegant business dress, understated yet professional. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the court reporter raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Bold choice," Judge Donovan remarked. "All right, let's not waste time. Opening statement, Horizon News Network. You're up." Michael Reynolds, Horizon News Network's attorney, approached the podium. Tall and polished in an expensive suit, his silver hair neatly combed, he wore glasses likely worth more than some people's cars in the room. "Your Honor," Reynolds began, "this case is straightforward. Ms. Leavitt, as press secretary, made false statements at a press briefing, causing severe damage to my client's reputation. We have evidence, recordings, articles, and by the end of this trial, the truth will speak for itself." Judge Donovan nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Ms. Leavitt, your opening statement." Leavitt stepped forward. She pulled some notes from her bag. One sheet fluttered to the floor. As she bent to retrieve it, someone in the gallery chuckled. "Your Honor," she started, her voice quieter than expected, "I'm here because Horizon News Network twisted my words from that press briefing to defame me and the administration I represent." She fumbled through her papers, seeming to lose her place. "What I said was about the new policy, and they edited it to distort it. I have some documents." She paused, looking confused. "Sorry, I misplaced them." Judge Donovan couldn't hold back. A soft laugh escaped. "Ms. Leavitt," she said, "this isn't a White House press room. We follow strict legal procedure here. Do you have your evidence ready?" "I think so, Your Honor," Leavitt replied, still fumbling with her papers. The gallery erupted in laughter. Even the clerk smirked. Donovan raised a hand for silence, her eyes glinting with amusement. She'd seen this before. Overconfident celebrities thinking they could wing it in court without preparation. From the plaintiff's table, Michael Reynolds shot Leavitt a smug glance. This was easier than he'd expected. In the gallery, a young woman with long brown hair, Rachel Sullivan, Leavitt's media assistant, watched with growing unease, her hands clenched in her lap. Things didn't seem to be going to plan. Perhaps, Judge Donovan suggested, her tone not overly harsh, "You should consider hiring counsel, Ms. Leavitt. Defamation law is complex." Judge Patricia Donovan continued, her voice gentle but tinged with skepticism. "Not something just anyone can handle without legal training." "I'll manage, Your Honor," Karoline Leavitt replied, finally organizing her notes. "Very well," Donovan said, her gaze flickering with sarcasm. "Horizon News Network, present your case." Michael Reynolds approached with 3 assistants wheeling in neatly arranged evidence boxes. Judge Donovan leaned back in her chair, casting a quick glance at her clerk and subtly rolling her eyes. The clerk smiled back, catching her drift. Reynolds set up a sleek presentation screen. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'll begin," he said. Donovan nodded. The courtroom lights dimmed, and a crisp slide appeared on the screen. "Horizon News Network published this article to the public," Reynolds started, pointing at the screen, "based on Miss Leavitt's press briefing, but she made false claims about administration policy, severely harming our credibility. We have the briefing recording. The published article, dates and content will prove everything." Judge Donovan listened intently, occasionally glancing at Leavitt. She was scribbling something, her face unreadable. "Miss Leavitt then denied her statements on television," Reynolds continued, "but this contradiction only reinforces our claim." Throughout the presentation, Leavitt remained oddly calm. Once, Donovan caught her staring at a random spot on the courtroom wall, and was she even focused? "Miss Leavitt," she interjected sharply, "are you keeping up?" "Yes, Your Honor," Leavitt replied, blinking as if snapping out of a thought. "Good," Donovan said, "because I don't want you wasting this court's time if you're not serious about this case." Leavitt gave a slight nod, her expression briefly tense but composed. As the morning session wore on, Donovan grew increasingly irritated by her apparent indifference. The first time Leavitt objected to something, her argument was so clumsy Donovan had to cut her off. "Miss Leavitt, that's not how defamation law works," she explained, her patience thinning. "Maybe you should take a crash course in Law 101. The courtroom burst into laughter, but what Donovan didn't anticipate was that the young woman before her wasn't as unprepared as she seemed. Behind the fumbling and messy papers, Karoline Leavitt was setting a trap that would leave everyone, including her, stunned. Months earlier, the atmosphere in a White House meeting room was tense. Bright light shone on a desk where Leavitt and Rachel Sullivan reviewed a press briefing video. On screen was Leavitt's speech about the administration's new policy. "Run it again," Leavitt said, eyes fixed on the screen. Rachel tapped a few keys on her laptop and the video replayed. "This is the original," Rachel reported, her voice excited. "Not a single word they're claiming." Leavitt didn't smile, but her eyes gleamed with determination. "If we can prove they edited it, this ends," she said. "This is the truth we're defending." Just then Leavitt's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "Nathan Pierce is here," she said. Rachel paled. "The CEO of Horizon News Network. For what?" "He wants to meet," Leavitt sighed. "Cover this up. I'll see him in the conference room." "You sure?" Rachel asked, worried. "Horizon News has twisted things before." "I've got it," Leavitt replied, heading for the door. "Hide anything critical." Nathan Pierce was tall, slick, with a perfect smile and a confident handshake. "Karoline, thanks for meeting me," he said loudly to assistants with tablets trailing behind. "What can I do for you, Nathan?" Leavitt asked bluntly, skipping pleasantries. "I'll cut to it," Pierce said. "Horizon News wants to partner with the White House on policy messaging. We've got reach, you've got influence, we sometimes lack." Leavitt nodded slowly. "Interesting. How do you see it?" "A meeting today," Pierce replied. "Then we'll hash out details. I want to know what you're working on." He grinned, his eyes sharp like a shark. "Leave it," Leavitt said. "Fine, but some things are in progress. Can't share them." "Of course," Pierce agreed quickly. As they walked through the White House halls, Leavitt noticed Pierce lingering in spots, his eyes scanning intently. At one point, she glimpsed an assistant snap a photo when he thought no one saw. At the main conference room, Leavitt stopped. "This area is restricted," she said. Pierce nodded, but she caught a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "I've seen enough to know we can do big things," Pierce said, shaking her hand. "I'll have my people reach out." After he left, Leavitt immediately called security. "I want all footage of Pierce's visit," she demanded. "Every second." That night, in her office, Leavitt reviewed the tapes. Sure enough, Pierce's assistant had snuck photos, and he peered through windows into restricted areas when he thought no one noticed. "Knew it," she muttered. 2 months later, Rachel burst into Leavitt's office, face flushed with anger. "Horizon News just ran a hit piece," she said, slamming a newspaper on the desk. "They claim you misstated facts at the briefing, the exact words not in the original." Leavitt picked up the paper, scanning it calmly, too calmly. "You're not surprised?" Rachel asked, watching her. "No." Leavitt leaned back in her chair. "Pierce never followed up on partnering. I knew something was off." "We've got to fight this," Rachel exclaimed. "Call the lawyers. I talked to them." Leavitt stood, walking to the window. "They say it's tough to prove. Pierce is careful. But I'll handle it myself." Rachel's jaw dropped. "You mean go to court yourself? You're not a lawyer." "True," Leavitt agreed, her eyes glinting oddly. In the weeks that followed, Leavitt's behavior turned strange. She canceled meetings, vanished for hours. Once, Rachel found her in her office at midnight, surrounded by defamation law books, margins packed with notes. "This is insane," Rachel said, picking up a book. "We have a legal team." "They'll expect a legal team," Leavitt replied, not looking up. "They won't expect me." "Because it's a bad idea," Rachel argued. "Pierce has got the best lawyers." Leavitt looked up, eyes tired but resolute. "Sometimes you do it yourself. It's justice and strategy." Rachel sighed, unconvinced. What strategy involves going to court unprepared? Leavitt smiled for the first time that night. "Who says I'm unprepared?" She turned her notebook toward Rachel, filled with precise notes, timelines, plans. "Trust me," she said softly. Rachel studied her determined face, worried this confidence might be a mistake. But she didn't know Leavitt wasn't just armed with notes. She had a plan that would stun the courtroom, especially Judge Donovan. Back at the trial, the first day resumed after the lunch break. Judge Donovan adjusted her black robe, glancing at the clock. Michael Reynolds had set up a large screen displaying a side-by-side comparison of Leavitt's original statement and Horizon News article. "Clearly, Your Honor," Reynolds said, pointing with a laser pen, "the similarities are undeniable. Tone, phrasing, even intent, all blatantly distorted." Michael Reynolds said, gesturing at the screen, comparing the two versions of the statement. From her elevated seat, Judge Patricia Donovan nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Reynolds," she directed. "Horizon News Network spent millions building its reputation," Reynolds continued, moving to the next slide. "Years of work went into that credibility, but days after Ms. Leavitt's briefing, she denied her statements on TV, confusing the public and harming us. The timing and coincidence speak volumes." In the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously. The case had drawn heavy attention from political media, journalists and curious onlookers packing the seats. "We'd like to call our first witness," Reynolds announced. "Dr. Thomas Carter, Horizon News Network's editorial chief." A thin, wire-rimmed, glasses-wearing man took the witness stand. After being sworn in, he sat, looking tense. "Dr. Carter," Reynolds began, "explain your role in handling the article about Miss Leavitt's briefing." "I led the editorial team that published it," Carter replied. "We relied on the briefing recording to accurately report what she said, the controversial words about administration policy." "And when did you start that work?" "About a few weeks after the briefing," Carter answered confidently. Judge Donovan watched Reynolds guide the witness through a detailed explanation. He was slick, making complex points digestible. She was impressed with both lawyer and argument. Occasionally she glanced at Leavitt. She remained eerily calm, taking notes, but rarely objecting. Once, Donovan caught her staring at a ceiling tile, lost in thought. "Miss Leavitt," she snapped, "are you keeping up?" "Yes, Your Honor," Leavitt replied, blinking as if waking up. "Miss Leavitt." "I'm just reviewing the testimony," Donovan frowned. "Review more actively. This is your case." A few spectators snickered. Donovan smirked faintly. She'd dealt with smug politicians before, but they usually at least pretended to care. The trial pressed on as Reynolds called a media expert to explain publishing processes and timelines. "As the court can see," the expert concluded, "our article ran before Miss Leavitt's denial, proving she lied." Donovan saw Leavitt jot something down, briefly curious about her strategy, then dismissed it. She was clearly outmatched. "Your Honor," Reynolds said, "I'd like to present the next exhibit." An assistant wheeled in a covered screen, and Reynolds unveiled a video of the edited briefing. "This is the recording we used," he explained, "captured entirely by Horizon News Network's team." In the gallery, Rachel Sullivan sat up straight, staring at the screen, her eyes narrowing as if recognizing something. Donovan noted the young woman's reaction and filed it away. Something about this video felt off. "Would the judge like to see it?" Reynolds offered. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," Donovan said, taking the video playback device. Though a judge, she'd studied communications in college, and this editing seemed sharp, effective. She returned the device, inwardly admitting it was impressive. Reynolds smiled, sensing victory. Now we call our final witness of the day, Nathan Pierce, CEO of Horizon News Network. The tall, slick man Leavitt had once met strode to the stand, confident. After being sworn in, he sat upright, exuding authority. Mr. Pierce, Reynolds began, tell us about your company's commitment to truth in media. Pierce launched into a smooth speech about Horizon News' history of credibility. Donovan listened, occasionally glancing at Leavitt. Surprisingly, she was now intensely focused, eyeing Pierce with a sharp, almost predatory gaze. For the first time, Donovan felt a twinge of doubt. Could this girl have a deeper strategy? Did you contact Miss Leavitt or the White House before publishing the article? Reynolds asked. Minimally, Pierce replied smoothly. We met briefly to discuss a partnership, but it went nowhere. Donovan caught a fleeting smile on Leavitt's face as Pierce finished. Reynolds approached the podium. Your Honor, Miss Leavitt has the chance to cross-examine the witness. Donovan turned to Leavitt. Miss Leavitt, do you wish to question Mr. Pierce? Leavitt rose slowly. Not at this time, Your Honor. I'd like to reserve my questions for later. Pierce looked surprised and relieved, stepping down with a triumphant glance at Leavitt. Very well, Donovan said, unable to hide her disappointment. She'd hoped for at least an attempt at a fight. Mr. Reynolds, proceed. Your Honor, Reynolds said confidently, we've shown Horizon News Network published the article first, and Miss Leavitt clearly lied to defame us. The evidence speaks for itself. Donovan nodded, finding Reynolds' argument sound. The case seemed clear-cut. Ms. Leavitt, she turned to her, you'll present your defense tomorrow. I suggest you prepare better than you did today. Leavitt looked up from her notes. Thank you for your concern, Your Honor, she said. Her tone held a hint of confidence that didn't match her outwardly weak position. As they prepared to adjourn, Donovan again caught Leavitt staring at a spot on the wall. Ms. Leavitt, are you focused? She asked sharply. Leavitt turned back, eyes clear and bright. Always, Your Honor, more than you think. For some reason, Donovan felt a chill. Perhaps Karoline Leavitt wasn't as simple as she'd assumed. But what could she do to overturn this mountain of evidence? Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning, Donovan declared, banging her gavel. As people filed out, Leavitt gathered her messy papers. Michael Reynolds passed by, smirking faintly. Good luck tomorrow, Miss Leavitt, he said softly, though I doubt luck will be enough. Leavitt just nodded. See you tomorrow, Reynolds. Outside in the hallway, reporters swarmed. Miss Leavitt, will you hire a lawyer? One shouted. Mr. Reynolds, is the case as open and shut as it seems? Another asked. Leavitt walked silently through the crowd. Rachel chased out after her to the courthouse steps. That was a disaster, Rachel said. Pierce flat out lied about your meeting. I know, Leavitt replied calmly. And that video? They edited my words. I noticed too, Rachel grabbed her arm, stopping. Karoline, you have to do something. They're destroying us. Leavitt glanced back at the courthouse, her face expressionless. I'm about to. 20 minutes later, they sat in a rented office across from the courthouse. Leavitt had turned it into a workspace with computers, a whiteboard, and document boxes. What do we do now? Rachel asked, watching Leavitt boot up a laptop. Prepare, she replied. I need you to get the original briefing recording from when Pierce visited. Rachel looked up from her computer. I've got the audio, now what? Find every audio and video clip from the day Pierce came to the White House, Leavitt said. I want every second he was there. For hours, they meticulously reviewed recordings and footage. Rachel suddenly exclaimed as she found what Leavitt needed. Here, she pointed at the screen. Pierce's assistant was secretly recording in a restricted area. Leavitt nodded. And this, she said, fast-forwarding to another clip. Pierce peering through the press room window after she'd warned it was off-limits. This proves they intentionally distorted it, Rachel said excitedly. But is it enough to win? Not yet, Leavitt admitted. We need more. She pulled out her phone and sent a text. Minutes later, it buzzed. Leavitt smiled as she read the reply. What's that? Rachel asked. Let's just say I've been preparing for this longer than Pierce thinks, Leavitt replied. By midnight, Leavitt was still hard at work. On the table sat a small device, an audio player. What's that? Rachel asked, yawning. A demonstration, Leavitt answered, for tomorrow. Shouldn't you focus on a legal argument? Leavitt looked up, her eyes glinting. Sometimes the best legal argument isn't in the law. That's not an answer, Rachel sighed. Trust me, Leavitt said, closing her laptop. By tomorrow, Judge Donovan won't be laughing anymore. That night, as Pierce and Reynolds clinked whiskey glasses to toast a seemingly certain victory, Leavitt prepared her final move. A simple cardboard box that would change everything. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with energy. Word of Leavitt's delay request had spread, with many speculating she was about to surrender. Reporters clogged the steps, cameras ready. "Miss Leavitt, have you hired a lawyer yet? Will you settle with Horizon News?" Leavitt walked through, cardboard box under her arm. Rachel followed, her calm demeanor masking anxiety. The courtroom was packed. Nathan Pierce sat confidently at the plaintiff's table, whispering to Reynolds. Both looked up as Leavitt entered, eyeing the box curiously. "What's she up to?" Pierce muttered. "Probably surrender terms," Reynolds sneered. Judge Donovan entered, and everyone stood. She noticed Leavitt seemed different today, no longer fumbling. She stood tall, eyes sharp and focused. "Court is in session," she declared. "Miss Leavitt, yesterday you requested time to reassess. Have you decided to get counsel?" "No, Your Honor," Leavitt replied, her voice stronger than before. "I'll defend myself." Donovan sighed dramatically. "Fine, are you ready to present?" "I am," Leavitt said. "But first, I'd like to call a surprise witness." Murmurs of shock rippled through the room. Reynolds shot up. "Objection! We weren't notified of a new witness." Donovan frowned. "Miss Leavitt, this isn't a TV drama. The court has procedures." "I understand, Your Honor," Leavitt replied calmly. "But this is exceptional. The witness only agreed to testify after yesterday's statements." Donovan studied Leavitt, noting her newfound confidence. "It better be worth it," she warned. "Who's the witness?" "Laura Bennett, former senior editorial chief at Horizon News Network," Leavitt announced. The name sent a jolt through the Horizon News team. Pierce paled, whispering urgently to Reynolds. Reynolds stood, flustered. "Objection! Bennett's bound by a confidentiality agreement. She can't testify about the company." "Not quite," Leavitt countered. "Bennett's agreement has an exception for illegal activity, which she'll address." The courtroom fell silent. Donovan leaned forward, curiosity piqued. "Mr. Reynolds' objection is noted but overruled. I'll allow the witness. Ms. Leavitt, it better be relevant." "Absolutely, Your Honor," Leavitt replied. The doors opened and Laura walked in, tense but resolute. After being sworn in, she took the witness stand. "Miss Bennett," Leavitt began, "what was your recent role at Horizon News Network?" "I was the senior editorial chief for 8 years, Bennett replied, her voice steady despite a slight tremble. "Why did you leave?" Bennett took a deep breath. "I resigned last week over ethical issues tied to the article about you in this case." The courtroom buzzed. Pierce whispered frantically to Reynolds. "Can you explain?" Leavitt asked. "The article wasn't based on truth," Bennett said firmly. "We were ordered to distort your words after Mr. Pierce visited the White House." The room erupted. Donovan banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" As silence returned, Michael Reynolds leapt up, face red with anger. "Your Honor, these are baseless accusations. Where's the proof?" "A fair question," Judge Patricia Donovan agreed, turning to Leavitt. "Do you have evidence to back this testimony?" "I do, Your Honor," Leavitt replied, finally opening the mysterious cardboard box. She pulled out a laptop and a small audio player. "Miss Bennett," she continued, "did Mr. Pierce specifically direct your team to distort my words?" "Yes," Bennett answered firmly. "After his White House visit, he called an urgent meeting. He played us a secretly recorded clip and told us to edit it to misrepresent your statement as fast as possible." Pierce went from pale to flushed, scribbling something and shoving it at Reynolds, who shook his head slightly. "What about Dr. Carter, who testified yesterday?" Levy asked. "Thomas was promoted to replace me after I objected to the ethics of this," Bennett explained. "He was willing to follow Pierce's plan." Reynolds stood again. "Your Honor, this is hearsay and speculation." "Is it?" Leavitt asked calmly. She connected the laptop to the courtroom's display system. "With the court's permission, I'd like to present evidence." Donovan nodded, fully engrossed. "Proceed, Miss Leavitt." The screen lit up with White House footage clearly showing Pierce's assistant secretly recording in a restricted area, and Pierce peering through the press room window, despite being told it was off limits. "This proves nothing," Reynolds argued. Listening isn't distorting? Maybe not, Leavitt agreed, but this does. She clicked the next file. Emails between Pierce and Bennett discussing how to edit Leavitt's statement. Reynolds stared at the screen, stunned. Where did you get those? Ms. Bennett provided them, Leavitt explained. Along with these, the next image showed a side-by-side comparison of Leavitt's original recording and Horizon News' edited version. The differences were stark. Donovan's skepticism vanished, replaced by astonishment, as the evidence piled up. Your Honor, Levy said, there's more. Ms. Bennett provided internal notes showing Horizon News had no plans for such an article before Pierce's White House visit. Their entire claim was fabricated. Pierce couldn't hold back, shouting from his seat, "This is a conspiracy! Don't believe her!" "Mr. Pierce," Donovan warned sharply, "control yourself, or I'll remove you." The courtroom's atmosphere shifted entirely. Now Reynolds looked rattled, while Leavitt stood calm, in command. Donovan turned to Bennett. "Ms. Bennett, do you realize the gravity of this testimony? You're accusing Horizon News Network of deliberate defamation and deception." "I do, Your Honor," Bennett replied. "I couldn't keep being part of it." As the morning session continued, Donovan regarded Leavitt with fresh eyes. The fumbling girl from yesterday was gone, replaced by someone precise, methodical, seemingly planned from the start. Was it an act? Had she deliberately played weak to lull Horizon News off guard? Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Donovan wasn't mocking Karoline Leavitt anymore. "Miss Bennett," Leavitt pressed on, "can you recount exactly what happened after Mr. Pierce left the White House?" Bennett straightened in the witness chair, hands clasped. Once a top editor at Horizon News for nearly a decade, she'd now become their nightmare. "That afternoon, Mr. Pierce called an emergency meeting," she began. "He was excited, played us the secretly recorded audio, and called it an information goldmine. At the plaintiff's table, Pierce's face darkened, scribbling furiously before shoving the note to Reynolds, who shook his head slightly. "Did he specifically mention my statements?" Leavitt asked. "Yes, he fixated on the part about the new policy," Bennett said. "He said it was a chance to discredit you and ordered us to drop everything else to edit the recording immediately. He said, 'I remember exactly. I want this story out before she can push back.'" Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Donovan leaned forward, fully absorbed in the testimony, unlike what she'd expected when the day began. "Did you object to this directive?" Leavitt continued. Bennett nodded. "I told Mr. Pierce it felt like deliberate defamation. I suggested working openly with the White House instead. How did he respond?" "He said, 'I recall precisely. Why ask permission when we can just take it?'" A ripple of reaction swept the gallery. Pierce flushed with anger, shouting, "Lies! She's making it up!" "Mr. Pierce," Donovan snapped, her voice icy, "one more outburst and I'll have you removed." Leavitt remained composed, unfazed by the drama. "Ms. Bennett, do you have any proof?" "Yes," Bennett replied. "I kept notes from the meetings, along with emails and messages containing these instructions." "Your Honor," Leavitt said, "I'd like to submit these documents as evidence." She handed a file to the court clerk, who passed it to Donovan. The judge opened it, reviewing the contents, her expression growing graver with each page. Reynolds recovered enough to stand. "Your Honor, these documents aren't admissible. They contain internal Horizon News information Bennett had no right to take." "Not quite," Leavitt countered. "Per Horizon News' employment contract, which I've included in the file, employees are protected and obligated to report illegal conduct. Miss Bennett acted within her rights." Donovan nodded. "I agree with Miss Leavitt. The documents are admitted." Reynolds sank back into his seat, stunned. Pierce whispered urgently to an assistant, who hurriedly left the room. "Miss Bennett," Leavitt continued, "what happened after you voiced your concerns?" "I was gradually sidelined," Bennett said. "Assignments were reassigned, and 2 weeks ago, Thomas Carter was promoted to replace me. I was moved to another department." "Was that surprising?" "No. I'd already been looking for other jobs because I couldn't keep working unethically. When I was reassigned, I quit immediately." "Final question," Leavitt said. "Before Pierce's White House visit, did Horizon News have plans for a similar article?" "No," Bennett affirmed. "We were focused on entirely different topics. Their plans were at least 2 years removed from anything you said." Thank you, Miss Bennett, Leavitt said, turning to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to present one more piece of evidence before Mr. Reynolds' cross-examination. Donovan nodded. Leavitt placed the audio player on the evidence table. This is a device I created to demonstrate that Horizon News' article was, in fact, a distortion of my words. She activated it, playing the original recording followed by the edited version. The differences were stark and undeniable. As the court can see, she explained, the editing is entirely distinct. The odds of two independent teams producing identical content are near zero. The courtroom fell silent. The evidence was overwhelming. Your Honor, Reynolds said, finally rising, we request a recess to confer with our client. Judge Patricia Donovan glanced at the clock. We'll break for lunch. Court resumes at 1 p.m. As the gallery emptied, Rachel Sullivan rushed to Leavitt's side. That was incredible, she whispered. Did you see Pierce's face? Leavitt gave a slight nod, maintaining a neutral expression. It's not over yet, she replied. In the hallway, reporters swarmed both sides. Reynolds pushed through silently, Pierce trailing behind, a bodyguard blocking cameras. Miss Leavitt, a reporter shouted, was yesterday's fumbling an act? Leavitt just smiled, no comment. In a closed meeting room, Reynolds faced Pierce across a table. This is bad, Nathan, really bad, he said. Pierce paced, furious. She's lying. It's her word against mine. Her word plus emails, messages, and documents against you, Reynolds corrected. Not to mention the distorted audio evidence. We need to settle now. No, I won't let her gloat. You may not have a choice, Reynolds warned. If we push forward, it's not just losing the case, this could turn criminal. Pierce stopped pacing, his face paling. What do you mean? I mean, deliberate defamation is a crime, Reynolds replied. So is perjury. You did that yesterday by downplaying your meeting with Leavitt. Pierce blanched. You're my lawyer. Fix this. I'm trying, Reynolds said coolly, but you need to face reality. Leavitt outplayed us. Meanwhile, in another room, Donovan sat alone, reviewing the morning's evidence. 30 years on the bench had taught her to spot liars, and Laura Bennett was telling the truth. The emails and documents aligned perfectly with her testimony. She began reassessing Karoline Leavitt. Initially, she'd pegged her as an overconfident young politician, but now she wondered if she'd been the amateur. Leavitt's strategy of feigning weakness to gather devastating evidence was brilliant. When court reconvened, the tension was palpable. Before Donovan arrived, Reynolds approached Leavitt. My client's willing to settle, he said quietly. I'm not interested in a settlement, Leavitt replied. Don't be stubborn. We can resolve this cleanly. That's not why I'm here, she said. Before Reynolds could respond, Donovan entered, and everyone stood. Before we proceed, she announced, I want to clarify something. Miss Bennett, your testimony suggests not just defamation, but potential criminal conduct. Do you grasp the seriousness? I do, Your Honor, Bennett replied. That's why I resigned and came forward. It's the right thing. Donovan nodded. Mr. Reynolds, you may cross-examine the witness. Reynolds approached the podium, his initial confidence gone. Miss Bennett, isn't it true you were passed over for promotions at Horizon News Network multiple times? No, Bennett replied calmly. I was offered promotions twice and declined to stay in editorial. And you weren't bitter when Carter got promoted. I was relieved, she said. It meant I no longer had to oversee a project I found unethical. Reynolds tried different angles, but Bennett didn't waver. Her testimony was clear, consistent, and ironclad. As he sat down, Donovan turned to Leavitt. Do you have more witnesses? No, Your Honor, Leavitt replied. Miss Bennett's testimony and the evidence I presented speak plainly enough. Donovan nodded thoughtfully. Indeed they do. The afternoon session wore on, and everyone in the courtroom gradually realized Karoline Leavitt wasn't just prepared. She'd orchestrated every moment, and she wasn't done. Your Honor, Leavitt stood. I'd like to address the remedy I'm seeking. Donovan nodded. Go ahead, Miss Leavitt. She stepped to the center of the room, no longer the fumbling girl from day one. She moved with purpose, her voice clear and confident. Based on the evidence, I'm not just seeking to dismiss Horizon News' claims. I'm requesting a specific remedy under the recently amended Media Honor Protection Act. Reynolds frowned in confusion. Donovan grew curious. Section 19C of this act, Leavitt continued, allows the court to bar a media entity from reporting on a defamed individual for up to 3 years if intentional distortion of truth is proven. The courtroom went still. Donovan leaned forward slightly. Ms. Leavitt, I'm familiar with defamation law, but I don't recall that provision. It's fairly obscure, Your Honor, Leavitt admitted. Added in the last amendment. It's rarely been invoked. She handed a document to the clerk, who passed it to Donovan. The judge reviewed it closely, her eyebrows lifting slightly. She's right, she murmured. Reynolds shot up. Your Honor, this is absurd. A 3-year ban would lock Horizon News out of major political coverage. That's the point, Leavitt replied calmly. The law imposes steep consequences for deliberate defamation. Otherwise, entities just treat fines as a business expense. Donovan nodded faintly as she read the statute. The language is clear, she acknowledged. In proven cases of media defamation, the court can impose a reporting ban. Pierce whispered urgently to Reynolds, who grew increasingly frantic. Your Honor, Reynolds said, we need time to review this statute and respond. Fair enough, Donovan agreed. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. She turned to Leavitt. I must say, Miss Leavitt, I'm impressed with your knowledge. Thank you, Your Honor, Leavitt replied, smiling faintly. I've done my homework. As the courtroom cleared, Reynolds approached Leavitt again, his tone almost pleading. Be reasonable. A 3-year ban would gut Horizon News's political division. You should have thought of that before distorting my words, Leavitt replied simply. In the gallery, Rachel watched the exchange, her eyes wide with awe. As Leavitt joined her, Rachel couldn't hold back. How'd you find that law? She whispered as they left. Because most lawyers don't know it, Leavitt explained. I spent weeks digging through obscure statutes. When I saw this one, I knew it was perfect. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed again. Miss Leavitt, are you really aiming to ban Horizon News from political reporting? Was the clumsiness a strategy? Leavitt repeated. No comment, pushing through the crowd. At the temporary office, Rachel was elated. You were amazing. Pierce looked like he'd faint when you brought up that law. Leavitt gave a small smile. The case isn't over, but it's trending our way. Judge Donovan is totally on your side, Rachel emphasized. She's doing her job, Leavitt corrected. Judges don't pick sides. They follow the law, which I happen to know better than their expensive legal team. Rachel laughed. Leavitt's phone buzzed with a message. She read it, her face turning serious. What is it? Rachel asked. Pierce's people called and threatened Miss Bennett, Leavitt said. That's witness intimidation. We need to report it to the judge. We will, Leavitt assured her. Tomorrow. Meanwhile, at Horizon News's legal offices, Pierce raged at his team. How did you not know about this law? He roared, pacing the conference room. I pay you millions to know exactly this kind of thing, Pierce bellowed, stalking back and forth. Michael Reynolds stayed composed despite the onslaught. It's a rare provision, seldom used. The issue now is how we respond. Fight it, obviously, Pierce snapped. I'm afraid that's unwise, Reynolds cautioned. The evidence against us is too strong. You're giving up? I'm being realistic. Leavitt's outmaneuvered us at every turn. First she played weak to lower our guard, then dropped a star witness we didn't see coming, and now she's found a legal angle that could ruin your business. Pierce slumped into a chair, reality finally sinking in. What options do we have? We could settle, Reynolds suggested, offer a big payout and a formal apology. Never, Pierce spat. I won't let her gloat. Then the only play left is to attack the witness, Reynolds said grimly. Discredit Laura Bennett, claim she stole documents for personal gain, suggest she's colluding with Leavitt. Will it work? Reynolds sighed. Probably not, but it's all we've got left. The next morning, the courtroom was more packed than ever. News of the surprise legal maneuver had spread overnight, drawing political reporters from across the region to fill the gallery. Judge Patricia Donovan opened the session. Before we proceed, I've reviewed the statute Ms. Leavitt cited yesterday. It does indeed apply if intentional defamation is proven. She turned to Reynolds. Counsel, do you wish to respond to Ms. Leavitt's request for a reporting ban? Reynolds stood. Yes, Your Honor. We challenge the credibility of Ms. Bennett's testimony and the authenticity of the documents she provided. On what grounds? Donovan frowned. We believe Ms. Bennett may have altered the documents after leaving Horizon News Network, possibly in coordination with Ms. Leavitt, Reynolds asserted. Donovan's brow furrowed. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? We're prepared to present a technical analysis showing the documents were recently modified, Reynolds said. Leavitt rose calmly. Your Honor, I anticipated this character attack on Ms. Bennett, so I had an independent forensic expert verify the original electronic documents. She handed a file to the clerk, who passed it to Donovan. This report confirms the documents are authentic, unaltered. Additionally, I must inform the court that Ms. Bennett received a threatening call from a Horizon News representative since her testimony yesterday. Donovan's face darkened. Is that true, Mr. Reynolds? Is your client aware that witness intimidation is a serious crime? Reynolds paled. Your Honor, if such a call occurred, it wasn't authorized by Horizon News' management or legal team. Donovan clearly wasn't convinced. The morning session continued, and Donovan watched Leavitt with growing admiration. The fumbling girl from 2 days ago was now delivering complex legal arguments with stunning precision. She nodded along to her reasoning, impressed despite herself. She wasn't alone. Some of Horizon News' junior lawyers also gazed at Leavitt with unconcealed respect. In the gallery, Nathan Pierce loosened his collar, anxious. The confident CEO, expecting an easy win, now faced a legal disaster of his own making. Your Honor, Reynolds said, making a last-ditch effort to salvage things. We request permission to call a technical expert to testify that Horizon News' article, while similar to Miss Leavitt's words, has significant differences. Donovan considered it. I'll allow it. Call your witness. A tall, neatly bearded man with glasses stepped to the stand. After being sworn in, he introduced himself as Dr. James Larson, a media expert from the West Coast Research Institute. Dr. Larson, Reynolds began, you've reviewed the recordings from both sides. In your professional opinion, could Horizon News have independently produced their article? Yes, Larson replied confidently. Though there are similarities, I noted several editorial choices distinct to Horizon News' execution. Can you elaborate? Reynolds asked, relieved. Certainly, for instance, the sentence splicing follows a different structure, and added phrasing is unique to Horizon News, absent from Miss Leavitt's words, Larson said, presenting a chart highlighting the differences. Donovan listened closely, her initial leanings now tempered by careful neutrality. She took detailed notes as Larson explained. So, in your expert opinion, Reynolds concluded, these two pieces could have been created independently? Entirely possible, Larson agreed. Similar issues often lead to similar solutions in media. Thank you, Dr. Larson, Reynolds said, turning to Leavitt. Your witness. The courtroom tensed as Leavitt approached the podium. Instead of a direct attack, she smiled politely. Dr. Larson, what made both versions of these recordings controversial? The core statement about policy, Larson answered promptly. And that part was edited through multiple steps, correct? Yes, Larson admitted. Leavitt nodded. Can you describe the editing sequence? Larson shifted uncomfortably, both cut the intro, added midsection context, then ended with a shocking line. The same sequence? Leavitt asked innocently. Yes, fairly similar, Larson replied, hesitating. And what are the odds of two independent teams using the same editing sequence with the same controversial phrasing? Larson squirmed in his seat. Very low, he conceded. Leavitt kept asking, seemingly harmless technical questions, gradually leading Larson to contradict his own testimony. Each answer left him more flustered. Let's cut to it, Dr. Larson, Leavitt finally said. The structural and phrasing differences you mentioned, aren't they just surface changes that don't alter the core content? After a long pause, Larson sighed. Yes, the core, the key statement is nearly identical. From the plaintiff's table, Pierce glared at his own witness, furious. No further questions, Leavitt said, returning to her seat. After Larson stepped down, Reynolds approached the judge. Your Honor, we'd like to recall Mr. Pierce to testify directly. Donovan nodded. Proceed. Pierce strode up, adjusting his expensive tie, projecting confidence despite his earlier unease. After being sworn in, he sat. Mr. Pierce, Reynolds began, did you instruct your team to distort Miss Leavitt's words? Absolutely not, Pierce replied firmly. I visited the White House to discuss a partnership. When it fell through, I told my editorial team to resume normal reporting. Had Horizon News prepared similar content beforehand? Yes, we always track administration policy, Pierce said. The article's timing after the meeting was just a coincidence. Reynolds nodded. Miss Bennett claims you showed her a recording and ordered distortion. How do you respond? Completely false, Pierce declared. Miss Bennett is a disgruntled employee upset over missed promotions. These accusations are her retaliation. Donovan observed Pierce closely, noting his polished confidence. He was a well-prepped witness, clearly coached by his legal team. No further questions, Reynolds said, sitting down. The courtroom hushed as Leavitt rose to cross-examine. She approached Nathan Pierce slowly, calmly. Mr. Pierce, you testified that Horizon News Network had prepared similar content before your White House visit, correct? Yes, Pierce answered firmly. Can you explain the basic premise of that reporting? Pierce faltered slightly. We always monitor political policies for timely coverage, more specifically about the content approach tied to my statements, Leavitt pressed. I'm not an editorial expert, Pierce deflected. I rely on my team for details. But you're the CEO who signed off on the article, Leavitt pointed out. Surely you understood what you were publishing. Pierce's confidence began to crack. Broadly, yes, he replied. Leavitt abruptly shifted gears. During your White House visit, did you record anything? No, Pierce answered. What about someone on your team? Not to my knowledge, he said. Leavitt nodded thoughtfully. I see. She stepped to her table, retrieving a file. Your Honor, I'd like to submit this recording as evidence. She played a clear audio clip showing Pierce's assistant secretly recording in a restricted area. Perhaps your memory needs refreshing, Leavitt gently suggested. Pierce flushed. I didn't know my assistant did that. Really? Because the next clip shows you looking right at her as she recorded, Leavitt said. The courtroom buzzed as the damning audio played. Leavitt continued methodically, cornering Pierce with each question. Every answer either contradicted his prior testimony or the documented evidence. Finally, Leavitt delivered the knockout blow. Mr. Pierce, do you recognize this notebook? She held up a small, leather-bound book. Pierce's eyes widened in recognition. Where did you get that? Miss Bennett provided it, Leavitt replied. This is your personal notebook, isn't it? Yes, but it was stolen from my office. Actually, Leavitt corrected, Ms. Bennett was tasked with clearing your office after a water leak incident. This was something she was instructed to retain. Leavitt opened the notebook to a marked page. Would you please read this entry, written right after your White House visit? Pierce stayed silent. If you'd prefer, I can read it, Leavitt offered, turning to the judge. Your Honor, may I? Donovan nodded, utterly engrossed. Heard Leavitt at the White House today, Leavitt read aloud. Controversial statement. Need to edit fast to discredit her before she can push back. Assign Bennett's team now. The courtroom erupted in excited whispers. Pierce paled, speechless, as Leavitt spoke softly. The room fell quiet as Pierce returned to his seat, shoulders slumped in defeat. Donovan glanced at the clock. We'll take a 15-minute recess. When we return, I want both sides in chambers. As people filed out, reporters rushed to update their stories. The case exploded overnight, with political news sites running live blogs. Leavitt's legal genius stuns court, one headline blared, trending on phones throughout the room. In the hallway, Reynolds pulled Pierce aside. This is a disaster, he hissed. We need to settle now. Too late, Pierce muttered, loosening his tie. She wants blood. In chambers, Donovan sat behind her desk, removing her glasses and rubbing her nose. 30 years on the bench, and rarely had she seen a case flip so completely. As both sides entered, she gestured to the chairs before her. Please sit. Leavitt and Reynolds sat. Pierce stood, too agitated to settle. I called you here because this case has taken an unexpected turn, Donovan began. Mr. Reynolds, given the current evidence, I advise your client to consider a settlement. Reynolds nodded grimly. We're open to discussing terms, Your Honor. I'm not, Pierce interjected. It's not over. Donovan gave him a stern look. Mr. Pierce, you should understand your position. The evidence against you is overwhelming. If I rule against Horizon News, which is increasingly likely, you won't just lose the case. You'll face a 3-year reporting ban, not to mention potential criminal investigation. Pierce paled but remained defiant. There's still the appeals court. Yes, Donovan agreed, but they typically uphold trial court findings. The facts here are deeply unfavorable. She turned to Leavitt. Miss Leavitt, are you open to a settlement? Leavitt considered it. I came here for justice, not money. The 3-year ban is non-negotiable. Pierce huffed in frustration. That's ridiculous. Ridiculous how? Leavitt replied calmly. When you distorted my words and then sued me for it. Donovan leaned back, regarding Leavitt with newfound respect. Then she did something unexpected. Ms. Leavitt, her tone softened. I owe you an apology. The room registered surprise, even Leavitt. I misjudged you when this trial began, she continued. I thought you were naive and unprepared. I was wrong, and my conduct was unprofessional. You've presented this case more thoroughly than most lawyers I've seen. Leavitt nodded in acceptance. Thank you, Your Honor. Donovan hesitated, then added, I think I should explain something. She glanced at Reynolds and Pierce. Could you two step out for a moment? After they left, Donovan stood and walked to the window overlooking Los Angeles streets. 4 years ago, my son worked for a local paper, she said quietly. One of his stories was twisted by a big media outfit, costing him his job. He struggled for months after. Leavitt's eyes widened in realization. I know how damaging false reporting can be, she said. I know it's not your fault, just a media decision. But as a mother, she shook her head. I let that color my initial impression of you. That was my mistake. I understand, Leavitt replied. Media decisions affect real people. I try to remember that. Donovan turned back. Your legal strategy was masterful, pretending to be unprepared to catch them off guard. I've never seen that. Sometimes creative thinking isn't just for politics, Leavitt smiled faintly. A knock interrupted. The clerk poked her head in. Your Honor, Mr. Pierce wants a private word with Miss Leavitt. Donovan raised an eyebrow. Rare indeed. I'll hear him, Leavitt agreed. When Pierce entered alone, his demeanor had shifted entirely. The arrogance was gone, replaced by desperation. Leavitt, he said abruptly, name your price. Anything. Just drop the 3-year ban. It's not about money, Leavitt replied. Everyone has a price, Pierce insisted. 10 million, 20? The ban stands, Leavitt said firmly. Your company tried to distort my work. There have to be consequences. Pierce's face darkened. You're enjoying this, aren't you, seeing me grovel? No, Leavitt said honestly. I want a fair fight where both sides report the truth. Donovan watched, noting the two powerful figures, only one still holding integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, she finally said, that's enough talk. Back to the courtroom to wrap this up properly. As they left, Pierce made one last plea. Leavitt, be reasonable. But Leavitt moved on, her mind already beyond the case. She had what she wanted, justice, and the protection of truth. Back in the courtroom, the gallery fell silent as they returned. Rachel Sullivan caught Leavitt's eye from the audience, raising an eyebrow in question. Leavitt gave a slight nod, and Rachel smiled in relief. Based on the evidence presented, Judge Patricia Donovan declared, I'm prepared to rule after final closing statements. Mr. Reynolds, Miss Leavitt, prepare your closings. Reynolds fumbled with his papers while Leavitt sat still, her notes neatly arranged before her. The outcome was no longer in doubt. She'd won. Mr. Reynolds, your closing, Donovan said. Reynolds stood, his initial swagger gone. Your Honor, he began, though Miss Leavitt's evidence is troubling, we maintain Horizon News Network reported based on legitimate methods. Miss Bennett's testimony should be doubted due to her strained departure from the company. He spoke for a few more minutes, his argument weak and unconvincing even to himself. Pierce bowed his head, no longer the arrogant CEO who'd entered the court on day one. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds, Donovan said when he finished. Miss Leavitt? Leavitt approached the podium, a far cry from her early awkwardness. She stood tall, her voice clear and steady. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. Horizon News' CEO came to the White House, secretly recorded and directed his team to distort my words. Their own documents and witness confirm this. Justice demands not just dismissing their false claims, but imposing the 3-year ban to ensure serious consequences for deliberate defamation. Short, simple, and ironclad. Leavitt returned to her seat as murmurs spread through the room. Donovan nodded. I'll rule now. The courtroom stilled, everyone aware this case meant more than just the parties. It would set a precedent for handling media defamation in the industry. This court has carefully reviewed all evidence, Donovan began. Laura Bennett's testimony, backed by electronic records and Mr. Pierce's notes, clearly proves intentional defamation. Pierce closed his eyes in defeat. Thus, Horizon News Network's claims against Miss Leavitt are dismissed, she continued. Furthermore, under Section 19C of the Media Honor Protection Act, Horizon News Network is barred from reporting on Miss Leavitt or the administration she represents for 3 years, starting today. Gasps echoed through the room. She hadn't just ruled for Leavitt, she granted her full request. Additionally, Horizon News must pay $1 million for reputational harm, plus all related legal costs. She looked straight at Pierce. The court also refers this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges tied to defamation and perjury. Pierce paled, and Reynolds steadied him with a hand. Before we close, Donovan added, removing her glasses and facing the press-filled gallery, I want to say something. When this trial began, I misjudged Miss Leavitt representing herself. I doubted her ability and, I regret to say, made unprofessional remarks. Whispers rippled through the room at this rare admission. The court corrects that now, she declared formally. Miss Leavitt proved creative thinking applies to legal strategy as much as politics. Her preparation and presentation were exceptional. Leavitt nodded, taking in her words. Court is adjourned. Donovan banged her gavel one last time. The courtroom erupted in lively chatter. Reporters bolted for the doors, eager to file stories. Pierce and Reynolds huddled with their team, faces grim. Rachel rushed to Leavitt's side. We did it, she exclaimed, eyes shining. You were amazing. We were amazing, Leavitt corrected. Your media expertise was crucial. As they packed up, Donovan approached. Miss Leavitt, a word in private. Rachel stepped away, leaving them alone. Remarkable case, Donovan said. I've never seen anything like it. Thank you, Your Honor, Leavitt replied. May I ask, day one, was that an act? Leavitt smiled faintly. Not entirely, I was nervous, but yes, appearing unprepared was strategic. Donovan shook her head in amazement. Brilliantly executed. By the way, my son's got a new job now, doing well, she added. I'm glad to hear that, Leavitt said sincerely. Congratulations on the win, Donovan said, shaking her hand. As they clasped hands, a mutual respect formed, absent just days before. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Leavitt. Miss Leavitt, how's it feel to win? Was the strategy planned from the start? Will you pursue criminal charges against Pierce? Leavitt raised a hand for quiet. I came here for justice, not revenge. The ruling speaks for itself. Now, excuse me, I have work to do. She pushed through to where Rachel waited with the car. As they drove away from the courthouse, Rachel couldn't contain her curiosity. What's next? Leavitt gazed out the window, already thinking ahead. Now we get back to what matters. Safeguarding the truth to shift perspectives. But she knew this case had changed something bigger, not just for her, but for the media industry. Next time a news outlet considered twisting the truth, they'd recall what happened to Horizon News Network and might think twice. 2 months later, a sleek black car pulled up to the White House gate. Patricia Donovan flashed her ID to the guard, who checked the list and waved her through. She'd retired from the bench a month after the Horizon News case, surprising the legal world. 30 years was enough, she told the press. Time for a new challenge. In the lobby, Rachel Sullivan greeted her with a smile. Judge Donovan, great to see you again. Call me Patricia, she replied, smiling back. I'm not on the bench anymore. Karoline's waiting in the conference room. Rachel led the way through bright halls where staff worked on policies shaping the future. Patricia sensed the energy in the air, a purpose that reminded her of her younger days. Leavitt met them at the conference room door, dressed casually yet professionally. Patricia, welcome to the White House, she said. Thanks for having me, she replied. Ready to see what we do? Over the next hour, Leavitt guided her through areas explaining how they safeguarded accurate information post-trial, along with initiatives that left her astonished. Impressive, Patricia said as they paused by a window overlooking the lawn. A far cry from the legal world. Is that why you retired? Partly, she admitted. 30 years fixing others' problems wears you down. I wanted change. They entered a small meeting room overlooking Capitol Hill, coffee waiting on the table. I have a confession, Leavitt said as they sat. I invited you today for a reason. During the trial, did you ever wonder why I represented myself? Leavitt asked. It wasn't just strategy. I wanted to face you directly. Patricia Donovan frowned. Face me? Why? Because I knew who you were, Leavitt replied simply. Not just a judge, but a journalist. Donovan set her coffee down, startled, her hand trembling slightly. What do you mean? Before law, you were Patricia Donovan of UCLA, who wrote a groundbreaking investigative series in the 1980, Leavitt explained. Your corruption piece was stolen by a big paper, right? Donovan blinked, memories flooding back. How did you know? That was ages ago. I always research my field's history, Leavitt said. Your work was too good. A media company, Pacific Press, took it and claimed it as theirs. That's right, Donovan said softly. I was young, naive. I sent them the draft thinking they'd publish it for me. Instead, they hijacked it. And that's why you went into law, Leavitt added, to protect others from the same? Donovan nodded, stunned that Leavitt grasped her story so well. Did you know you were assigned my case because of your media background? Leavitt asked. Of course, Donovan replied. Courts often pick judges with relevant expertise. But you didn't know, Leavitt continued. I uncovered that connection early. I dug into your history. When I learned you'd preside, I tailored my legal strategy to hit both your media knowledge and personal experience. Donovan's eyes widened in realization. So the clumsiness on day one was to make everyone, including me, underestimate you? Leavitt smiled in confirmation. Exactly, Donovan laughed, surprising herself. I should be mad you played the court like that. I saw it as knowing my audience, Leavitt replied. The evidence was real, the law was real. I just framed it so you'd see it clearest. Brilliant, Donovan conceded. Utterly brilliant. They sat quietly for a moment, two minds finding unexpected common ground. So why am I really here today? Donovan finally asked. Not just for a tour and this reveal, I assume. No, Leavitt agreed. She opened a folder on the table, sliding it to her. I have a proposition for you. Inside was a contract. I need someone who gets both media and law to help the White House safeguard accurate info and navigate complex legal issues. Donovan raised an eyebrow. You want to hire me? I want to partner with you, Leavitt corrected. Your experience as a journalist whose work was stolen and a judge who upheld truth makes you uniquely suited. I haven't practiced law in 30 years, Donovan pointed out. You won't need to, Leavitt said. You'd have a legal team under you. What I need is your judgment and insight into both fields. Donovan flipped through the contract, weighing it. This is a big shift. A shift that advances truth, Leavitt replied. And I doubt you retired just to sit idle. Donovan laughed again. You know me too well. She stood, walking to the window overlooking Capitol Hill. For decades, she'd enforced law from the bench. Now she had a chance to protect truth from the inside, shaping rather than just judging. She turned back to Leavitt. Before I decide, one question. This offer, or your courtroom strategy, was it about payback for my son losing his job when a big outlet twisted his story? No, Leavitt said honestly. That was a media thing, not my doing. This is a job decision. I think you're the right fit. Donovan was satisfied with that. She took her judge's robe, carried in her bag, and laid it on the chair, a symbol of shedding her old role. Sometimes, she said, echoing Leavitt's earlier words to Rachel, you have to do it yourself. Leavitt stood, extending her hand. Welcome to the team, Patricia. As they shook hands, both knew this was the start of something significant. Two brilliant minds, once adversaries, now allied for a shared cause. Meanwhile, in a nearly empty office at Horizon News Network's headquarters, Nathan Pierce packed his last box. The board had forced his resignation. The 3-year ban had gutted their political division, and criminal charges still loomed. He'd once thought he was clever, twisting truth instead of building it. Now he understood what Karoline Leavitt had always known. Real truth can't be stolen, it must be earned. The story of a judge mocking Karoline Leavitt in court, then being stunned by her legal genius, is more than a dramatic tale of courtroom victory. It reflects real issues in American society today. especially the intersection of media, truth, and justice. In the current landscape where misinformation floods social media and big outlets sometimes distort facts for self-interest, as Horizon News Network did with Leavitt's statements, this story underscores the importance of safeguarding honesty in a world rife with disinformation. Leavitt, as White House press secretary, faced defamation charges from Nathan Pierce, who secretly recorded and edited her words to discredit her and the administration. This mirrors real U.S. cases where politicians and public figures are targeted with falsehoods, like during the 2020 election or recent policy debates. The biggest lesson here is that persistence and smarts in facing injustice can turn the tide, even when you're underestimated. Leavitt feigned clumsiness to throw Pierce and Judge Patricia Donovan off guard, then used evidence, original recordings, emails, Pierce's notebook, and a rare statute to win and impose a 3-year ban on Horizon News. It's a reminder that in real-life America today, when dealing with rumors or unfairness, like being smeared at work or online, don't give up fast. Prepare thoroughly, seek the truth like Leavitt did with documents and witness Laura Bennett, and leverage the legal system or rules available to defend yourself. Leavitt's move to recruit Donovan afterward also shows the value of turning foes into allies, a useful lesson in an American culture that prizes collaboration and forgiveness post-conflict. Apply Leavitt's creativity and grit. Though mocked at first, you can still prove your worth and shift how others see the truth. In an age of info chaos, truth doesn't protect itself. You have to fight for its recognition. Thanks for following Karoline Leavitt's thrilling legal journey. Subscribe so you don't miss upcoming stories of justice and truth. See you in the next video, where we'll keep exploring the unexpected wins shedding light on life in America.